Hey y'all, today's article is called Evaluating Performance of National Hockey League Players After a Concussion versus a Lower Body Injury. It was published in 2019 in the Journal of Athletic Training by Van Pelt et al. And associated institutions were the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor and the University of Delaware. This study set out to find if players returning from a concussion differ in performance from players returning from a lower body injury. And it was basically looking at if brain injury is going to affect a player's performance more than a musculoskeletal injury will. In order to answer those questions, the researchers identified players who had missed games due to a concussion, lower body injury, or non-injury related reasons during the 2013-14 season and 2014-2015 season. The players they identified were 34 forwards and 22 defensemen. There were no goalies included in this study. In order to account for as many variables as possible, players who had suffered a suspected concussion were identified, and then lower body injured players or non-injured players were identified that matched several of the criteria. Some of the factors they used to match these players were their position, time on ice, how long they were out from the injury, and their team. In order to measure performance, the researchers used a modified plus-minus statistic. But because plus-minus can be strongly affected by whether the team you play for is good or bad, they adjusted the statistic so it took into account how well their team was playing. Okay, so the statistical analysis found that both the concussion and the lower body injury group showed decreased performance in the first 2 weeks following their return to play, but there was no significant difference between the two groups themselves. By 5 to 6 weeks after their return, performance had returned to pre-injury levels. And then the group that missed time due to something besides an injury did not experience the same deficits. The main focus of the discussion was why athletes returning from concussion and lower body injury have similar outcomes. The reasons could be similar, where it's just fatigue after returning, where they're trying to get back into the swing of things, or it could be something with top-down, bottom-up processing, where with a concussion, they are struggling with concentrating and have a slowed reaction time, so they're struggling with top-down processing, compared to a bottom-up processing with the lower body injury, where the biomechanical issues are what is holding the player back. And then some research they brought up also indicated that the effects of a concussion linger even when the player is asymptomatic. This could be reassuring in a way, because if these formerly concussed players do have slowed reaction time and other physiological changes, it doesn't appear to affect their performance any more than a musculoskeletal injury would. The main limitation of this study is one we've discussed before and one that we will discuss again, and it's the lack of specificity in the details that the NHL releases regarding injuries. When the researchers went through the data to try and find athletes who had had concussions, several times it was listed as an upper body injury rather than specifically a concussion, and an upper body injury could include a shoulder ligament sprain, a broken arm, or a concussion, so it requires additional digging to be able to find confirmation of the injury itself. They relied on public data, not medical records, but by using multiple databases, most concussions during the time period that was studied were probably identified. Again, there's just not that specificity with what's reported, and it makes it difficult to study specific injuries in elite hockey. Another limitation identified was that, again, the researchers weren't able to identify previous concussions due to the lack of specificity. So they weren't able to distinguish whether multiple concussions would drive the relationship between concussion and athletic performance. And then the last two limitations are pretty closely related. The first mentions how one of the factors they couldn't really account for was difference in the game situations pre-injury and post-injury. And these include playing time, teammates that they're playing with, teams that they're playing against, and these all could have effects on difference performance metrics. The final limitation they mention is how the statistic they used of adjusted plus-minus is likely not sensitive enough to detect the performance deficits. They proposed that in the future, shooting percentage could be a possible metric to measure for forwards, but they were not able to access that specific value for the data in this study. As a result of this study, the researchers concluded that there was no difference in post-injury performance between concussion and lower body injury, and that the initial changes would be present with any injury and were not specifically limited to concussions. They also stated that any decline in performance was temporary and resolved within 5 to 6 weeks of returning. This study is interesting to me due to its similarity to the Buckley article we discussed during the first video. They had similar findings in that concussion did not have a strong effect on player performance, but the difference between the two studies was the Buckley article compared against non-injury related time missed. But yes, again, both studies found that there were no significant differences in personal metrics, either pre-injury or post-injury. That's all I have for today. Thanks for watching. If you have a question or comment, feel free to leave it below, and be looking for another video tomorrow. Thank you.